All right. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for joining us for the fifth webinar in our six-part series, The Arts of Eastern Europe and Eurasia, which is designed to support educators in bringing the rich artistic traditions of Russia, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia into their classrooms. Today's webinar will focus on the art of theater. My name is Sandra Gudic, and I'm the Education Outreach Administrator at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. So this series is designed for educators, but is essentially a collaborative initiative between 8 different universities and their regional centers. All of us essentially cover Eastern Europe, Russia, and Eurasia. So aside from the Davis Center, we're collaborating with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Pittsburgh, University of Kansas, the Ohio State University, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Indiana University, and University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So as a reminder, each of the 90-minute webinars in this series will focus on a different art form, ranging from music and dance to literature, visual arts, cultural artifacts, and theater and film. We encourage you to register for what's now left our final session, which will take place next month. While the webinars are designed as part of a cohesive series, you're of course welcome to attend as many or as few as you'd like. So just reminding educators who are planning to attend or have been attending all 6 sessions, and they will be eligible to receive 10 professional development points or contact hours, and make sure that for tracking purposes, if you are seeking credit, we could see your full name displayed on Zoom so that we can mark you present. And so after this long welcome, I will turn over the stage to Alicia, and she will introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alisa Baca, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Slavic, European, and Eurasian Studies at The Ohio State University. And tonight I'm very excited to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Alisa Lin. Dr. Lin is an Associate Professor and Graduate Studies Chair in the Department of Slavic and East European Languages and Cultures at The Ohio State University. A specialist in theater and performance studies, Russian, Polish, and Ukrainian literature and culture, Russian psychology and philosophy, film studies, and costume and textile studies, her research spans the intersections of performance, belief, and embodiment across Eastern Europe. She's the author of Theatrical Consciousness, The Actor's Mind in Russian Modernism, which was released last year by Northwestern University Press. And she is also completing a monograph titled I Don't Believe You, Christianity, Performance, and Belief in Russian and Eastern Europe. Her scholarship has appeared in leading journals and edited volumes. Lin received her PhD in Slavic Languages and Literatures from Princeton University and her BA from Brown University. She also serves as the president of the Midwest Slavic Association, which is one of 6 regional affiliates of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. In addition to her academic work, she writes We Who Tend, which is a Substack newsletter on care and work productivity, and is deeply engaged in mentoring students on time management and work-life balance. And without further ado, I will pass the mic on to Alisa.
Thank you, Alicia. Okay, so I am so incredibly excited that this many people are here to talk about East European theater. This is amazing. And I hope that we have an enjoyable time going through all of this. So on the topic of my surprise at your presence, theater is kind of a weird thing, right? So I think especially in the United States, most of us don't really go to the theater. Maybe like a community theater production, maybe a national tour of Hamilton or Wicked or something like that, right? But we don't really often like regularly attend theatrical productions. That is a more insular community, the people who do that in the US. And so I think that we, as a result, in the United States, we might be skeptical that theater can have significance beyond itself such as social or political significance. Um, Another reason why it's just awesome that we're all here to talk about theater is that there's this really common bias against studying theater for the reason that it is impermanent. So a performance happens and then it is never recreated in the exact same way. It cannot be fully recaptured. We will simply never know what the famous 1911 production of Hamlet at the Moscow Art Theater actually looked and felt like. Of course, we have photographs, we have various sketches, various materials, but we can't access the movement, the temporality, the energy of the room, right? All of these things. Of course, more recently, productions get filmed, including some that I'll be talking about for you all. But videos have their limits. They don't, again, really capture the experience of the live audience. All of this means that when we study theater, we are essentially only studying the shadows and traces of something we can't recover, which makes studying theater more challenging, but also perhaps more exciting, which is what I hope to continue convincing you of in this presentation. Studying theater is an actively creative process. Now, why study Russian and East European theater in particular? So, unlike as I described in the US, um, in this region, the situation is somewhat different. There's a very long history of theater as a vehicle for political, social, and artistic boldness. Theater in the cultures of Eastern Europe and Russia has long been affordable and abundant. There's this, I think, really striking statistic that in Poland between World War I and World War II, there were over 400 Yiddish language theaters. This is how just incredibly theatrically fertile this entire region is. Eastern Europe is a theater-going place. Ordinary people know the major stars on local stages. Theater is greatly respected. I mean, ask any random American to describe the history of American theater, and you will probably get nothing. But ask someone in Eastern Europe, and they will tell you. Um, Another important thing to understand about theater in Eastern Europe that will be important for everything I talk about today is that there is no assumption of realism, right? So, like, I think typically if an American imagines going to the theater, they expect that the set will be realistic. If it takes place in an apartment, maybe there's a kitchen, maybe there's a bed, right? And, actors will wear like whatever clothes suit the real life status of their characters. This has not been true in Eastern Europe since the late 19th century. Instead, it is very, very normal for theater to be wacky and strange and wild and amazingly exciting and creative. So costume sets, movements, dialogue are most often not at all lifelike. So what I'm doing in this webinar is focusing on materials that are fairly well known and easy to access in English because I want you to be able to take them into your classrooms as you see fit. I've also selected materials that exhibit theater as a vehicle for political, social, artistic protest. I do want to give the caveat that given the realities of what materials have even reached translation and availability in English, these performances that I present here will be kind of disproportionately skewed toward the larger countries of the region, Russia especially, Ukraine, Poland. All right, let's keep going. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a super brief East European theater overview, just for context. And then I'm going to present three major productions that have a lot of material that can be worked with in the classroom. And then I will just go quickly through, I think, about 5 moments of really performance art, so not traditional theater, but performance art used as political protest. This picture here is from a Kosovar theater production, by the way. Kosovo is a very rich place for theater. Theater history overview. Here we go. Okay. Theater began in Eastern Europe, typically a bit later than in Western Europe. Many cultures of Eastern Europe had various kinds of street performers. The kind of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus area had these people called skomoroki, which actually comes from Italian. It was an Italian idea, but brought into Eastern Europe as a kind of traveling minstrel-like figure. And actually, this image that's at the top right here kind of shows the sort of gesture, play, and dancing and such that the skomoroki would do. This picture here is a vertep. Vertep is a type of religious nativity puppet theater. So Christian nativity scene puppet theater that has been acted in the regions of Ukraine, Belarus, Serbia, and a bit of Russia since about the 17th century, maybe slightly earlier. And this was a big theatrical route for this area. Religious performances, but not that many because the church was suspicious of the theater. School dramas, these were the main places that plays were started to be written in Eastern Europe, were in the context of school performances. So performances, early stage performances in this region borrowed on Western Europe, but the sort of domestication of the Western Europe traditions really started to happen by the 18th century. Um, the 19th century is very interesting across this region because theater is still in tension with the church, theater is still in tension with the state. And to be clear, I'm speaking very generally of a huge area. And of course, there are various nuances by region. Many countries in Eastern Europe have a realist era, kind of 19th, mid 19th century era playwright who is the kind of like, most canonical figure in theater of that culture. So we get lots of very good playwrights in the 19th century, and then things start to get creative and exciting, starting in the 1890s with the onset of modernism, which really breaks up what the stage can do. Konstantin Stanislavski in Russia does this major reform in how theater is, how a theatrical production is put together, namely kind of consolidating and shaping the performance under the director's vision, which was not the norm in Europe prior. Not generally anyway. Um, and that starts to completely change how theater is done. This modernist experimentation continues through the early 1920s. This is a picture here from major Ukrainian director Les Corbas. And so through the 1920s, so after World War I, 1917, but then things start to get darker, and we get to maybe the title is slightly misleading, but I would say from the late 1920s is when we start really seeing repression and censorship in the USSR. And so censorship, repression, various sorts of artistic dampening starts to happen in Yugoslavia, kind of around this time, 1930s, 1940s. And as many of the nations in Eastern Europe continue to adopt socialism following World War II, there are also elements of censorship and repression depending on the particular nation. So because post-World War II, most of Eastern Europe is socialist, which tended to come with an artistic agenda. Theater still has some degree of looseness. Definitely by the 1960s across this region, there are efforts to expose the realities of Stalinism, expose the realities of, say, the Soviet Gulag, or things about World War II and the Holocaust, there starts to become room to talk about these things in the theater. So I wouldn't say that post-World War II Eastern Europe is heavily censored. That would not be correct. Um, yeah. And then post-socialism. So by post-socialism, the Eastern European nations abandoned socialism between 1989 and 1991. So various things, lots of various things in various countries have happened since then. But speaking again super generally, immersive theater, which you may be familiar with in the US, the company Punch Drunk is pretty well known for immersive theater, where you kind of enter a space and the whole experience is theatrical. Documentary theater is a big, so immersive theater starts in Britain. Documentary theater actually in this particular variant starts in Moscow and expands particularly to Belarus and Ukraine. And this is a major, major innovation of the early 2000s. Um, Multimedia online-based theater has been huge, VR-based theater. This is happening everywhere in the world, but it has definitely taken hold in Eastern Europe, especially post-COVID, or I guess during COVID and post-COVID. Theater continues to play an incredibly active role in community building and national identity in Eastern Europe. In terms of censorship, it's sort of it varies greatly from place to place. Russia is under very heavy censorship. Belarus is under very heavy censorship of the theater at this point. Hungary has a good bit of censorship of the theater, but there's still some looseness. And Serbia has a bit. But other nations have, relative freedom. And so today the region is quite variegated. Let's talk about the key theater works. Okay. So I'm going to present three performances from different countries, from different points in history of the past century or so. The first one I want to talk about is from 1922. So this is 5 years after the Russian Revolution. And so Russia has become communist and socialist, and 1922 is the year in which the Soviet Union is formed. The Magnanimous Cuckold is a production directed by Vsevolod Meyerhold in Moscow. Meyerhold was a major, major director of the Russian theater. He's kind of a classic. Anyone who does theater globally today is familiar with him because he's a canonical figure. Meyerhold, prior to the revolution, did a lot of kind of commedia dell'arte, jester-like stuff, cabaret, kind of goofing around, kind of theater of small forms, as it was called. So not like big dramatic plays, but sort of little skits. And when the Russian Revolution happened, he was extremely excited about it. He was very much on board. He was the first major theater person in Moscow to be totally on board with the revolution and the socialist experiment. And he started producing stuff that became emblematic of a new kind of socialist theater. The Magnanimous Cuckold is one of such artworks. And remember, again, this is the early 1920s, so there's not a lot in terms of censorship. There's a lot of push, in fact, to be really creative and to align art with politics. And that is exactly what Meyerhold does here. So one piece of this production that's important to understand is that Meyerhold had this new form of training actor training called biomechanics, and he presented this actor training as like the new socialist actor training because it really prioritizes the body over the psychology, what it looks like are really exaggerated movements. There are videos on YouTube of these like set of exercises that make up the biomechanics exercises for actor training. And you can totally do them, experiment with them. And they are a very good lesson in recognition that acting requires a lot of physical dexterity and control. Um, yes, so you can watch these on YouTube, and I will send you the link of that and some information that Sandra will send later. I want to share with you. So Meyerhold, like what was so exciting about him in 1922 was that he kind of announced biomechanics as like, this is the how an actor should be in the new Soviet Union. So this is a quote from a public lecture he gave in 1922. He said, "In art, our constant concern is the organization of the raw material. Constructivism, which is an art movement that is exemplified by this image here, has forced the audience to become both artist and engineer. Art should be based on scientific principles. The entire creative act should be a conscious process, right? So you have to like really consciously move your body. There's no kind of funny subconscious psychology going on. The art of the actor consists in organizing his material, that is, in his capacity to utilize correctly his body's means of expression. The methods of Taylorism being the kind of like factory assembly line, Henry Ford type stuff, basically, really basic terms, may be applied to the work of the actor in the same way as they are to any form of work with the aim of maximum productivity. So it's kind of an idea that the what the actor does on stage is akin to like any other worker in the mines, in the factories, wherever. Like it's a particular kind of work, and the movements can be mapped out and practiced, and you can get skilled on them. This is just a constructivist image. I won't say too much about that, except that you will kind of see a similarity between this image and the set for the magnanimous cuckold. Um, the magnanimous cuckold was Meyerhold's presentation of biomechanics to the public. As you can see, even in this image, which I think might be a posed image, the actors are doing these kind of big dramatic gestures, right? Like there's a lot of expansion of the body and like smooth movement of the body. So the set is constructivist. It's this kind of wacky, totally non-realist construction, right? There's this windmill here, which goes along with what the play is about. This 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 thing spins. The windmill spins. This thing with some letters on it spins. It's a moving mechanical set. The play, The Magnanimous Cuckold, is a Belgian play by Fernand Kromelnik. It is not a particularly famous or widely performed play, and in fact, the plot is a bit odd. It has to do with infidelity, and the husband suspects infidelity, and then he ends up trying to connect his wife to all the men in the village because he is so paranoid anyway, it doesn't matter. What matters, right, is how Meyerhold stages it. Um, so that is the set. I have some more pictures. You can see this kind of like totally non-realistic action. And I want to talk a bit finally about the costumes. You can see here these costumes, these loose utilitarian pieces. This is also similar, again, loose and utilitarian. I have a lot of pictures of the production. As you can see, the set is very abstract. Okay, so these are costume drawings. The costumes were designed by a very famous Russian artist, Lyubov Popova. And what is interesting about them is that they align with Meyerhold's idea of elevating the worker in line with Soviet values, and turning the actor into a worker. So Meyerhold had this idea that actors would all wear this kind of loose utilitarian overall of sorts, or kind of full piece thing, um, in order to be able to act and remove the kind of pretenses of realism. So again, kind of a political angle. And why is this production significant? To sum up, I would say that it used a bold and politically agitational set costumes and movement style. Note that they were not oppositional to the regime. They, in fact, supported the regime, or how the regime was at that time, but they were highly politicized. Um, They cemented Meyerhold, the production cemented Meyerhold as the leader of the new Soviet Union. Do note that things would start to change under Joseph Stalin in the late 1920s, and in 1940, Meyerhold is shot by firing squad, precisely for the kind of stuff he was doing in the 1920s, because it was thought to be too abstract, too ambiguous, too inaccessible, too strange, and a threat to the regime, right? So the regime basically like changes their mind. Let's talk about number two. So this is a jump to 1975 in socialist Poland. Poland becomes socialist in 1952 and ends socialism in 1989. This is another really, really major kind of world famous canonical director, Tadeusz Kantor, who's pictured here. This is not a theater shot. This is just a shot of Kantor lifting up a kettle for some reason. Um, and this production is extremely well known, in part because there's a film version of it, a made-for-TV film directed by Poland, one of Poland's greatest film directors, Andrzej Wajda, and it is available on YouTube. Though the quality is kind of poor, but I assign it to my students and they all tolerate it. So I think it's okay, and you'll get the link to that too. And but the like theoretically there is a better version. I've just had trouble finding it. So a bit about Kantor is just that he was born in 1915 in a Catholic family, but he became extremely interested in Jewish culture and Jewishness, especially after World War II in Poland. Poland in 1975 was kind of dealing with the same sort of like economic, political shakiness that much of the Soviet satellite states, so states that were not part of the Soviet Union, but that were aligned with the Soviet Union, many of them were experiencing this. Um, it was a rough time, but a time that allowed for some degree, again, of freedom and certainly of artistic creativity. Contour is his own unique, kind of amazing thing, but he certainly fits into larger European movements in absurdism and existentialism, theater of the absurd, much of which got started as a reaction to the totalitarian regimes of the World War II era. So he fits into that. Let's talk about the production. Okay, so this production is called a dramatic seance, and indeed, I think that's a really good word for it. So I assigned this to my students at Ohio State. They watch the video, and then they come to class completely baffled, asking me, how could this possibly be theater? But then we talk about it and we restage bits of it, and they come to really like it and find it really, really meaningful. I think there's a lot of potential to work with this in the classroom. So to just kind of tell you how it works, most of this production, hang on, I think I might have a slightly better picture. Most of this production takes place in this really like claustrophobic classroom space where the audience member is looking upon tight rows of desks. And see these students who are all middle-aged adults wear formal suits. They often carry mannequins. One woman carries a window, you can see in the image on the right here. Their speech is often nonsensical. So this play does not have a real like narrative trajectory. The speech is often nonsensical. It's often a form of chanting, sometimes people shouting at each other. Um, and occasionally there are more comprehensible parts that tend to reference Jewish history. So a very clear connection is being made to the loss of Jews in the Holocaust. And the tones of all of this speech become mournful, desperate, pleading, anguished. Um, it's the whole experience of watching it is that it's very wacky and strange, but quite heavy and serious. And I think kind of figuring out how that all works together is the real joy, the puzzle of working with this production. So the production evokes the weighted memories of the Holocaust, the thin line between life and death, and understandings of collective emotion. I've twice had students do this, watch it and so forth, and then we sort of stage some of the chanting and movement and the nonsensical stuff. And in both cases, the students on their own came to this understanding that very interesting kind of social dynamics start to emerge when you have a group of people all saying nonsense. And that I think is a big part of what this production is about, is like how this collective memory, how this collective experience is created and provoked. Okay. I want to give you, so Kantor was quite a writer. He did all of these productions that were not based on plays by other people. He kind of put them together. He was also quite a writer. He wrote a lot of manifestos, and I picked a couple of chunks here of some of his manifestos. They are kind of hard to work through, but I think they're worth it. So these were some chunks that I thought were a bit more comprehensible. So this is one that's from earlier than the Dead class. He says, in my last production, a dramatic text is not presented, but discussed, commented on. The actors speak the lines, reject them, return to them, and repeat them. The parts are not assigned. Thus, the actors do not identify with the text. The performance turns into a mill grinding the text. Does the mill interpret the product that it grinds? So yeah, I get that it's a bit obtuse, but I think that you can kind of work out this concept that Cantor is thinking differently about the role of text in theater, right? And so like the role of this nonsensical speech in the Dead class is not exactly that of like typical theatrical lines. And then this one is a quote from his manifesto, The Theater of Death, which is he wrote kind of simultaneously with the Dead class. And he says, I'm trying to delineate the motives and intents of this unusual creature, the mannequin, which has suddenly appeared in my thoughts and ideas. Its appearance complies with my ever deepening conviction that it is possible to express life in art only through the absence of life, through an appeal to death, through appearances, through emptiness, and the lack of a message. The mannequin in my theater must become a model through which pass a strong sense of death and the conditions of the dead, a model for the live actor. Okay, so I get that this sounds kind of morbid for K to 12 students, but Cantor does not intend it to be needlessly morbid. So when we see these characters in the production carrying the mannequins and kind of having to like the mannequins become this kind of weighted object that they like really have to heft around, and it showing these inanimate bodies becomes a way for the production to wrestle with the Holocaust and its complete transformation of Polish society, right? So I think a lot to explore in how Contour captures death through this strange use of mannequins. Okay, let's talk about number three. Okay, so number three is a little bit different in that it's not a production, it's a play. And I want to present it not as like this play is a magnificent achievement that the world is thrilled about and will be canonical forever kind of thing. It's not really that. The truth is that there has been a boom in Ukrainian playwriting as a vehicle for promoting Ukrainian perspectives and independence. There has been a boom in translating Ukrainian plays into English and in staging Ukrainian plays worldwide. And so amidst this kind of like body of work that has emerged, um, I picked one that I think is quite good and could be worked on very easily with students. And it is called A Dictionary of Emotions in a Time of War by Astasyeva in 2022. So she wrote this immediately following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. In her hometown of Kherson, Ukraine. Kherson is a city in the southeast of Ukraine, relatively close to Crimea, the peninsula that Russia seized illegally in 2014. So Kherson is like a kind of important city for Russia to try to take and so forth. And of course, the Russo-Ukrainian War has been in place since 2014 and has been elevated to this horrific tragedy since 2022. So I find that it's just important to talk about. So this is Olena down here, Astasyeva. This is Astasyeva. This picture over here is from a staging of this play in, I think, Canada by Ukrainian diaspora communities in Canada. And what I have here, this is again from that same Canadian production. I have put some of the text of the play on this slide and the next slide just for us to look at. So this play is short and it consists of these short vignettes that don't really, like, there's not really, again, a narrative through line, right? It's more like these little scenes that all work together. Some of them are written in prose, some of them have dialogue, but they all have a lot going on in them that I think students can really play with, and it's kind of easy to just give like a short bit and have students play with it, right? Performance. So here's a segment called Cleaning, where she says, I hate dust. I really should vacuum the place. But what if they bomb the apartment? Then why the wasted effort? What if they evacuate us and we have to leave immediately? No point mopping the floors. Does one need to clean an apartment in a time of war? Does anyone know what the rules are on this? And here are a couple more. Betrayal. I didn't understand immediately what was going on. Why were my cultured friends from Russia mumbling abstract phrases like, I oppose war, instead of saying, my government is committing a crime. It has been seized by evil forces. I am in despair and don't know what to do. So one of the kind of things that becomes a theme in the play is like her communications with her Russian friends and how they just like don't acknowledge the reality that she's living. And it's really hard. Weather. As I woke up this morning, I heard thunder in my sleep. I thought, it's going to rain. Then I came to fully and realized those were shells exploding. So it's called A Dictionary of Emotions, and indeed, like there are a lot of different emotions. There's really a lot of material to play with. And there's also this short film that is available online in this kind of obscure place. I will send you the link. It's only like 12 minutes long, and it's not a it's not a filming of a production, a theater production. It's like a film on its own, and it's in English, and it's whimsical and sad and just totally wonderful. I think I really enjoy it. This woman here with the like posh little blouse and so forth, she's the Russian friend who's like living this, pleasant and lovely life with really no understanding of what's going on in Ukraine. And this is I think, the main character who is experiencing her life falling apart in her soul. All right, so now we are at the last section where I will relatively quickly go through, I think, 5 examples of performance art from this region. Performance art that is used as political protest. So this is not like, you know, productions on a stage. This is stuff out in public. Some of it is only performance in a really loose sense, but these are all like important things. And again, this is not comprehensive. There are gazillions of other examples out there. These are just ones that I think are most um, portable, most useful. Okay, so I'm going chronologically. The first one I chose is a performance artwork by Marina Abramovich, who I suspect some of you are familiar with because she has a kind of global fame at this point in her life as a really radical performance artist. She's been living in the US for decades. And she does all these extreme stuff, extreme things, like famously, she did a performance where she had a loaded gun and she was right there, and the audience was invited to do what they wanted with that gun. But this is an early piece by her that she did in Belgrade, Serbia, her hometown. And it's more pointedly political. So she created Yugoslavia, right, is communist but auto so Yugoslavia of the like mid 20th century is communist but autonomous from the Soviet Union. They have their own communist practices. And Marina Abramovich, she lay inside this star that is supposed to symbolize the communist star of Yugoslavia. And she just lay there, in fact, until she passed out from lack of oxygen. And the people watching this didn't even realize that she had passed out at first. Um, so she's always pushing her body to an extreme, right? But it's kind of suggests something interesting, I think, to think about regarding the oppressions of communism as practiced in Yugoslavia and her own agency in her body. All right, let's do another one. So this one is not exactly a performance art. Now that I look at it. Okay, I just want to tell you about this because it's pretty cool. So Václav Havel is this famous Czech playwright turned politician. So Havel wrote a number of theater of the absurd plays in Czechoslovakia in the 1960s and into the 70s that got a lot of attention. He became a very well-known playwright in Czechoslovakia. He then started getting involved with protests against the socialist government of Czechoslovakia. He wrote this very famous political essay called The Power of the Powerless in 1978 that is commonly taught in political theory courses. In this political essay, he says, yet at the same time, each person is capable to a greater or lesser degree of coming to terms with living within the lie. And what that means, and so here's the piece that I think could be used with students. The Power of the Powerless, which is available for free online, presents this story of the like greengrocer, so like the grocery store person, who receives in their regular batch of like regular produce delivery a sign that says "Workers of the World Unite," which is a communist message slogan. And so Havel's point is that this greengrocer puts up the sign in the window, even though he doesn't care about it and he doesn't believe it. But he does it because that's what you do. Okay, so first of all, I find this remarkably theatrical, and I actually like act this out with students, and we sort of talk about what's going on and all of the dynamics. Um, but in the essay, Hubble uses it, and I don't think you would probably assign the essay, but you can talk about some of the ideas that Hubble Hubble talks about like how this kind of collective mentality forms that that makes the greengrocer afraid to not put up the sign. So the lie is that he puts up the sign even though he doesn't believe it. We live within the lie if we're putting up the sign, right? And so the essay kind of takes this all apart. But yes, he became president of Czechoslovakia in the late 1980s, and then the first, president of Czechoslovakia once Czechoslovakia had renounced communism, so 1989, but then he oversees the split between Czech Republic and Slovakia, as they are now known, and so he was the president of the Czech Republic. So quite remarkable that theater and politics align so neatly. Okay, this is called the Baltic Way. This is, I mean, it's not exactly like, I don't think anyone thought of it as performance art, but I think it can be viewed or like studied in that context. This was a human chain of 2 million people across Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania on August 23rd, 1989, demonstrating against the USSR because they were part of the USSR and they were sick of it for many, many reasons. And in fact, they did this on the anniversary of the day in which the Soviet Stalin agreed with Hitler that he could take Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. It's really this whole region, the Baltics, get totally crushed and destroyed in the World War II era. And this was successful, and Lithuania soon after this became the first nation to secede from the USSR. Okay, this one is just a really famous one that probably some of you have just heard of because it was on the international news back in 2012 that these artists, these women, did this performance in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow. The Cathedral of Christ the Savior is the seat of the Russian Orthodox Church, right? So this would be like performing in the Vatican, or, like this is really big deal stage. And so they do this like totally unauthorized thing that is intended to call out Putin's alignment with the church. The very close kind of suspicious things going on between Putin, corrupt relationship between Putin and the church. And they were all arrested and have been in prison and various things, and I think have emigrated. I don't know. But this was, I think, at the time viewed as quite a sign of like feminist power, and unabashedness and audacity. And then I think this is the last one. These are, so in 2020, Belarus had a kind of revolution. Revolution in quotation marks, as it's often rendered. Basically a series of political demonstrations against Belarusian president who is totalitarian or a dictator, whatever you want to call him, Alexander Lukashenko. He's certainly authoritarian. In 2020 to 2021, these were the largest protests in Belarusian history. So Belarusia is a very, very repressed, like tightly overseen by the government state. I think it is the nation in the world that has the most people per capita in prison. And so what was really interesting and kind of performative about these protests is that they brought out this white, red, white flag, which is not the flag of Belarus. It is a historical flag of an independent Belarus that briefly existed after World War One, right? And so it just kind of like the Baltic Way thing. It's kind of a symbol of everyone coming together and showing in a very visual and performative way that they oppose the government. And then the last one, I realized there actually is one more, is the blank paper protest. I just wanted to acknowledge that this has all kind of died down, I think, but certainly in 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine in full military force, there were attempts at protests by Russians, as well as increasing regulation coming down from the Russian government to stop these protests. One of the things was banning the word war in public discourse. And so people would hold up these blank signs. This is not original to Russia. This is like a concept that has been used in China and some other places, but it does really speak to the level of oppression and also the level of braveness on the part of these individuals to hold these signs up. And it also reminds me of a lot of the Havel Greengrocer story, where everyone knows what the sign actually means, right? Everyone knows that that the greengrocer sign, Workers of the World Unite, actually does not mean that the guy supports that sign's message, but it means that this guy is like complying with this socially constructed thing. In this case, everyone knows that this is an anti-war protest. I think that's it. Yes.